All right. Hello. IMF Attribution, and some of this is from 2008 to 2018. So I'll just cover some of what's here. It's not obvious to everyone why certain quantities would be noted to certain dimensions of chemical change and consistent or coherent evolution. But the faster we do it should also be mentioned. So maybe there's four issues, right? Wide market, the most as an optimum attributor. So all of this is attribution. It doesn't necessarily stipulate anything, but as a constraint structure or a possibility to propagate psychological rationality and so probability propagation, right? Choose one. Performative. We also like that. Global program for desalinized water irrigation. Renewables focus on solar. Some of this is in the $80 trillion range for things like legacy funds. And now Barack Obama made a significant attempt to deal with the climate change issue. So moving things towards constitutional fidelity and having the Office of Science and Technology Policy come up with realistic or median attributions within mathematics or however for social cost of carbon is reasonably important, right? Presidential attribution and so policy limits and how that seems to be a central focus, whereas in the case of IMF rationalization of special drawing rights for special circumstances, we don't, it's not always for sure, but towards fidelity, there could be conditions. And so some of that relates to technology types, and some of that relates to systemic risk. If agriculture, global drought timelines, then systemic risk. And so how soon, it's correct in some ways to make the assumption that allocation adjustment is well attuned to how fast, so not to go too fast with allocation or aggregation as a difference between one thing and the other. If we're doing something ubiquitously, there's multiculturalism. Believe it or not, it's directly relevant to receptivity. Region elasticity. This is a concept like how are we attractive to negative response in the case of adoption, right? So if it's going to be wind, solar all over the place, then what dynamic and spatial movement counteracts that impetus, policy or otherwise. So there was counteract criminal extrajudicial. We've had years of experience with what happens in the case of oil and gas and culture. That's for sure. All kinds of renewable energy, direct to corporates, actors, benign input. So you want to find people who aren't easily swayed by difficult imposure that has no ground in constitutional fidelity. So conflict prevention, human rights, nutrition, because people want to eat all the time before they want to become receptive to some huge project. Well, that makes a difference to my community if I'm well taken care of, like food, place to live, Maslownian stuff. So North Korea, for central media focus in the case of manipulating the process of the annual COP processes, quite a bit of scale for democracy stabilization, required emissions levels, and nutrition. People passing out on the way to work because they can only eat a small amount of rice, because there's a perceived strategic imperative beyond carbon abatement. So North Korea and China for renewable energies, solar manufacturing. So how do manufacturing rates time with deployment, basically? So if there's a demand, all of a sudden, because we realize the logical difference between carbon, non-carbon energy, not necessarily price. If we're scaling cost of carbon to price, you must be kidding me. So basic economics and logic. So systemic risk, they probably think of agriculture and different issues first. Sometimes it's things like nutrient collapse or phytoplankton oxygen. So there's a list. I made a list of pressing issues and then applied a logical structure to what was available in terms of peer-reviewed science, and then how that relates to NGO or news output from moderate, not necessarily alternative news, just stitial email subscriptions that pertain certain categories of knowledge. And then drought relief, because onset, it's already an issue at time. Okay, media channels. So informational depth, and covered some prevention for algorithm trading, because on different exchanges all around the world, you end up with situations where we'd rather take from other localities than support central media access to situational. So, we can have emergency sessions, but how does that relate to trading for vectors instead of trading on logic and renewable energy? Okay, timelines. So making sure that there's enough economic elasticity for people like Christina Figueres to complete. And anytime you move from an innate nature as realization towards a computation space, you're moving away from the essentialism of a natured rationality. So it isn't the Zeitgeber space, because sometimes computation takes place in a closed environment. It's paper trail, verbatims, and information. And you're only as good as your head, right? What you can think is your informational value. So new information, realization, of course, but not always there with environment. They always use a duplicity environment, duplicity climate as this vague escape category for an actual location that has nothing to do with nature. My goodness. So field dominance. So poverty and advantage. we don't need to save anyone from climate change because they're poor. It's amazing. So you can spend money on that till the cows come home and see if the psychology changes. Did a bit of program writing, a one-liner here. Hercules aircraft, so pallet positions, food access, export protein, food items, shoes and clothes. Some of this is post-X in terms of causation cycles and carbon, that we need to find our shoes. My goodness. So the list goes on and on. This is the old stuff from 2008 to 2012. I could talk for hours. Oh yeah, economic attribution for Tenzin Gyatso. Direct input, stability, optimism, what he generates in terms of human knowledge, lassitude, right? It's not high potential thought that really generates valid human communication and consistent change. So really amazing, beyond description, an amazing person and amazing changes. Both the Pope and Tenzin Gyatso are very sure that we're interested in climate change, and there's some common validity in assumptions and descriptions there. So I also have a list of people: Thomas Bergenthal, Richard Clark, Fatou Bensouda, Amy Goodman, Seymour Hersh, Francis Boyle, Noam Chomsky, Vladimir Putin. Surprisingly enough, we want all his money, but maybe he's that's because he's aggressive. My goodness. Angela Merkel, Niels Harriet, Jan Utzon, Per Herdegard, and some other folks here. Michael Morell as well, who would care to mention that assessments, so Exingery and non-orator, for more energy type. So Oliver Stone, of course, because we want to know why we gain entry. So dare to suggest military coercion and nanotechnology, biology, information, cognition, but we would always want to know more, and no, it doesn't happen. Green Climate Fund people, global reforestation programs, tautologies, non-conflict derivatives, ecological ecosystem stability, so nature stability, how do we rationalize, and what's market, right? We know it's a big difference for where we're at with systemic risk, but it's extremely diverse logic. It's doing things with strategy, it's doing things with resilience, but primarily it's carbon abatement. Very quickly. Anyway, so quickly, the most money and more money than you can possibly imagine. It's almost ridiculous. And then this is more recent, UN Office of Legal Affairs, and some work there. Anyways, that's enough for now. It's an endless list, but I'll cover more later if there's interest. All right, be well, until next time.